Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Plants, Pests, and Pathogens. I'm Ariyah April, Program Assistant for the NC State Extension Master Gardener Program. Today, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Michael Reiskind, who'll present on smart mosquito control, protecting people and pollinators in the home landscape. You'll see in this graphic, there's a lot to know about mosquitoes, some things that we don't know yet. It's an unpopular insect. We're going to learn about it today and how to control it. We're going to have a few minutes after Michael's presentation for him to answer questions. So please drop your question in the chat and we'll attend to it in the Q&A. Afterward, Matt Bertone and Mike Munster of the NC State Plant Disease and Insect Clinic will cover our BOLOs, or the plant pests and pathogens to be on the lookout for. To wrap it up, we're going to hear from Charlotte Glen, Program Manager of the NC State Extension Master Gardener Program. And Charlotte's going to present Plant Bees for Pollinators on Goldenrod, along with a few statewide program announcements that you don't want to miss. We were so excited about the Great Southeast Pollinator Census that happened this August. It's an annual event where folks across North Carolina and the Southeast participate in the Citizen Science Project to collect data about a wide variety of pollinators. And of course, these data sets are uploaded to the Great Southeast Pollinator Census website, where scientists and researchers aggregate all of that info, and then we'll learn more about our pollinator counts in a month or two. So it's a pretty exciting citizen science project. We appreciate everyone who participated. As you can see here, more than 100 events in 35 counties across North Carolina, 4,300 North Carolina data sets were submitted. That's fantastic. That's more than double our counts last year. So thank you so much to everyone who participated. Now to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Michael Reiskind is a researcher and educator who studies the ecology of disease vectors, particularly mosquitoes and ticks. Michael also investigates mosquito diversity and its impact on disease transmission. He's a dedicated professor and a director of graduate programs in entomology at NC State. He also advises students at both the undergrad and grad levels in their research. So welcome, Michael. I will turn it over to you now.
Great, thank you. And thank you for this opportunity to speak with you all. I actually had no idea how many people would be here, so I'm thoroughly impressed. It's more than one per county, I think, for the state of North Carolina. That's pretty awesome, although I probably don't have every county represented, but still really impressive. I'm going to start with a little bit about me. So kind of what gives me the right to sit here and talk to you guys about mosquitoes and mosquito control. I'm a professor and the director of graduate programs in entomology in the Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology. I'm also the graduate program director in the Global One Health Academy, all at North Carolina State University. I have a general research interest in public health entomology and the ecology of arthropod vectors and One Health. And what this means is essentially I study the insects and other arthropods, mostly ticks, that transmit pathogens to people and animals. Mostly I focus on people, although we do have some projects on an animal pathogen that I'll talk about briefly in a little bit. And in my lab, we mostly focus on mosquitoes and ticks, with a pretty heavy focus on mosquitoes. Now, in addition to my research, some of which I'll mention later today, I also have a teaching appointment, and so I teach forensic entomology, or the use of insects in the courts, primarily focused on using insects to help solve murder, crimes. I teach medical and veterinary entomology and One Health as well. My educational background, I have a bachelor's degree in biology and then a master's of public health and a PhD from the University of Michigan, and I did postdoctoral training at the University of Florida. So with that in mind, today's talk is going to focus on mosquitoes. I'm happy to answer questions about ticks. I will mention some other biting insects near the end of the talk, but my main focus will be on mosquitoes as the major pest that people are going to encounter in their backyards, in their gardens, essentially. And so I hope this is appropriate for this audience. Again, happy to answer questions about ticks, tick control, etc. later on, because I know that's a major concern in the United States, kind of throughout the United States, but emerging concern in North Carolina as well. Okay, so first some mosquito basics. This is what, when we say mosquito, I think this is what most people think of, something that looks about like this. This is our eastern treehole mosquito, so a common mosquito that we have throughout the state. And a couple things to note. All mosquitoes are flies. This means they're in the order Diptera. Diptera just means 2 wings. All of the flies have just 1 pair of wings, and all flies are insects. Okay, so a couple things to note. Insects have wings, and they have 6 legs, so you can take a look at those, and that kind of defines insects. And then in Diptera, there's just 1 pair of wings, and the hind wings of all the flies are modified into halteres. So if you see those little knobs behind the wings, those are called halteres. Their purpose is actually as a flight stabilizer. Turns out that losing a pair of wings actually made many of the flies some of the better flyers in the insect world, and those halteres kind of help us determine whether something is a fly or not, and they also help the fly, as it turns out. Okay, as in all flies, mosquitoes have an egg, larval, and adult phase, and we're going to talk about some of the specifics of those in a moment. And then all the mosquitoes are related to each other. They're all in the same, what we would call monophyletic family called Culicidae. You don't need to know the scientific name, but just know when we say mosquito, we mean this one family. They're all related to each other. That's not always true for insects. You call something a bug and who knows what you're talking about. All right. A couple things about mosquitoes. They're pretty diverse, actually. As you probably all are familiar, insects are very diverse. There are many, many different species of insects, and mosquitoes are a fairly diverse family of flies. There's about 3,700, could be as many as 4,000 species worldwide, about 180 in North America. There's 62 species of mosquitoes in North Carolina, and at least 28 just in Wake County. Now, I realize that we are a statewide, I'm speaking to a statewide audience, so we'll stick with that 62, but about 30 in every county or so that we've bothered to do surveys of. There's probably more, but we don't often do intensive surveys at the county level, with a few exceptions. And here are just some examples of the diversity of mosquitoes you might see in Wake County. Every one of these species is found just in Wake County. So you can see some are, well, you can't tell size that well from the photos, but some are bigger than others. Some are shiny, some have striped legs, some don't have striped legs, some have, wings with spots on them, and some don't. And it turns out that all this diversity is really important for us to understand when we assess the threat to public health of a mosquito, as well as what kind of pest is that mosquito going to be. Mosquitoes share a common life cycle. All mosquitoes require water to grow. The growth phase of mosquitoes are called larvae, and they are always aquatic. So we can start anywhere, of course, on a cycle. This is like a chicken or an egg thing. So we'll start with the egg stage. So mosquitoes lay their egg either in water or right next to water, where the egg will eventually be flooded and hatch. Those eggs hatch into what we call a first instar larvae. They go through 4 phases or instars at the larval stage. One interesting thing to note about mosquito larvae, which I think you will be able to see my cursor, I hope anyway, which is this phase here, is that even though they're aquatic, mosquitoes are not able to breathe the oxygen in the water. They actually have to breathe air. And so for this kind of mosquito, it has this little snorkel, we call it a siphon, that it puts up into the air and breathes through that. Right? In the old days, you could spread oil on water in order to kill larval mosquitoes by suffocating them. We do not recommend this as a control approach because of the non-target effects on anything else living in that water and the pollution that spreading motor oil on water would lead to. But it does illustrate something important about mosquitoes, that they have to breathe air. All right, so they grow up in water, and as in all insects, this immature larval phase is the growing phase. Once an insect becomes an adult, it no longer grows. Now they produce eggs, they need energy to fly around, but they're not actually doing any growing. There is a pupal phase in mosquitoes, kind of the same as a cocoon for a moth or a chrysalis for a butterfly, It's actually a mobile phase. It doesn't eat, but it's mobile. And if you look closely at this photo of this emerging adult insect, you can see the different stages of the larvae, right? These are called wrigglers because they wriggle around. And you can also see the pupae. These are these kind of, looks almost like a little comma if you looked at it closely. It also has to breathe from the air. It actually has two little breathing tubes instead of a single breathing tube. They're called trumpets. They look a little bit like Shrek's ears if you're familiar with Shrek. All right, and then they emerge from this pupal phase. All right, there are no parthenogenic female mosquitoes that we know of, so they have to mate in order to fertilize eggs. And they also have to blood feed. In this case, somebody was lucky enough to get a photo of both happening at the same time. This is the male mosquito. All they do is mate and then die, essentially. So they're smaller than the females. They have about a 3 to 5 day lifespan. The females, though, for the most part, have to take blood. That helps them produce a batch of eggs. They lay their eggs, thus completing the life cycle. Okay. Now, insects are wonderful because they're so diverse. Even within a family of insects, there's incredible diversity. So there are always some interesting exceptions about the life cycle that I just shared with you. And the first one that I think is pretty awesome is this mosquito, which is a native. This one in particular is a native of North Carolina. I actually took this photo in a backyard in Raleigh, actually of my children's piano teacher's backyard, but whatever, doesn't really matter. This mosquito doesn't take blood, all right? So this mosquito is predatory as a larvae. It eats other mosquitoes. And then as an adult, it just feeds on flower nectar. The reason this mosquito is able to do this is it gets enough protein as a larvae by eating other larvae that it can just produce eggs. The females can just produce eggs without taking blood. Most of the other mosquitoes have to take blood to get the protein necessary to make eggs. So this is like everybody's favorite mosquito because it eats other mosquitoes and it doesn't blood feed on you. Another cool exception are the mosquitoes that lay eggs not on the water, but near the water. And this includes the tiger mosquito we'll talk about in a minute. They lay eggs that can survive drying out. They actually time them in this way to hatch only when the environment is good, because after they've been reflooded, right? And so these eggs can last months. In fact, they spend all winter as egg. And so they last all winter long waiting for the spring rains to let them come back out. Actually, before I go on to this one, I'll go back one and just note that this other egg I have pictured here is a species that also lays eggs that can dry out. And in this case, some of these species, some of these eggs can stay dry for years, waiting for a big rain. It's probably one reason why after a hurricane, we have such a massive explosion of insects, of mosquitoes, because we're talking about mosquitoes whose eggs have been sitting there waiting maybe for multiple years, building up millions, I don't know, billions of eggs ready to hatch. All right, and then this last one is just so cool. I said most of the mosquitoes have to breathe air. Well, this is true for this mosquito too, but instead of breathing air from the atmosphere, this mosquito actually digs its siphon, its little snorkel, into a plant root underwater. So it actually can stay underwater, but it still has to breathe air, and so it breathes air through the air that flows through plants. So it's kind of taking it straight from the source, if you will, of plants. Turns out this photo is a species of this genus that does this that's not from this country, but actually one of the most common mosquitoes in North America does this as well. It's called Coquilitidia perturbans, but it's very similar, but this was the best photo I could find. Okay, so now I'm going to go through and just tell you about a couple specifics about mosquitoes that are probably the most common problem in kind of the backyard setting. The first ones, I call them the tigers in your toilet bowl, because these are the mosquitoes that have adapted to living in tree holes naturally. That is to say, any tree where a branch is broken off and now it fills with rainwater. And the adaptation to this habitat has allowed them to adapt themselves to just about anything that can hold rainwater. And in particular, the kind of refuse that we throw out, whether that's tires, like in the picture on the left here, or this old cooler in a broken down boat, that's filled with rainwater and is a great habitat for the larvae of this mosquito. Okay? And these are Aedes albopictus, or the tiger mosquito, and Aedes aegypti, or the yellow fever mosquito. And these are both mosquitoes that are found in North Carolina, at least historically. The tiger mosquito came into North Carolina in the mid-1980s. It actually pushed out this yellow fever mosquito, also not a native, neither of these are natives, and has become the #1 pest in your backyard. All right, and it turns out that this habit of formerly being in tree holes and then adapting to containers is really important for invasive mosquitoes. And so now we also have Aedes japonicus in North Carolina. California recently has been invaded by an Australian kind of similar mosquito called Aedes notoscriptus. Aedes coreicus, which you might imagine is from Korea, hasn't made its way to the United States yet, but is invasive throughout Europe. But not to worry, we sent our own similar mosquito, Aedes atropalpus, to Europe, to invade Europe over the last 20 years. And what this speaks to is the ability of these mosquitoes to get around the world and become problematic pests really anywhere, but including in our backyards. The other thing that I'd like to talk about, which I alluded to earlier, is what happens when we get hit by a hurricane in North Carolina. And it turns out that we have kind of a different group of mosquitoes, not ones that are really specialist in these small containers that fill with rainwater, but lay these eggs that can last for maybe years in the environment. They produce lots of eggs. These are very big mosquitoes. And when we have an extreme rainfall event, like a hurricane, they can come out in massive numbers. And this has been a consistent issue, particularly in the coastal plains, although we'll see these giant emergences of mosquitoes anywhere that we have flooding, particularly flooding that is aseasonal, like not in the spring, and of an extreme nature. Massive numbers of mosquitoes, including one called the gallonipper, because it'll nip a gallon of blood, Pseudophora ciliata. And this is a very big mosquito. Those of you who live on the coastal plain after a hurricane, these are the ones that get the press, although there are millions of other mosquitoes also becoming really important. Interestingly, they are also predators of other mosquitoes, although they still take blood, so not quite everybody's favorite mosquito. And they get good press coverage like this. After Florence, we had a massive emergence. The timing was just right. It was actually right around this time of year, if I remember correctly. We went out and did some collecting. Now, I've never seen mosquitoes like that. We also did a lot of press, like this article for CNN. Okay, so mosquitoes are most notorious probably as pests for us in the United States, but they're also vectors, which means that they can transmit a pathogen from one person to the next person. And so you can imagine, we recently had our COVID-19 pandemic went through. It had what we call an R naught of about 1.5 to 3.5. The R naught is just a way of measuring how infectious pathogen is. How quickly does it get from one person to the next? And it means just simply that for every case of COVID, you expect to get anywhere from 1.5 to 3.5 new cases. Right? Anything above 1 means that that disease is going to spread in a population. Anything below 1 actually means the disease won't spread in a population. So 1.5 to 3.5 is actually moderate, not extreme. Measles, 18. Every case of measles you have, you expect 18 new cases. Luckily, we have a vaccine, so we can prevent outbreaks of measles pretty easily. But it's one reason why when vaccination rates go down, measles is one of the first ones to kind of come back, because it's so infectious, right? Mosquito-borne diseases are really interesting. It's actually harder for us to mathematically kind of estimate this, but we are able to do it. And essentially what can happen, because now the mosquito is doing the work for the pathogen, we can have very high R naughts, anywhere from 1.3, which is pretty low, to 500. We estimate that in malaria, you can have as many as 500 cases spread from each person who is sick with malaria. And this happens because that person isn't just bit by one mosquito, they're bit by 50 mosquitoes. Those 50 mosquitoes bite 3 other people. right? And that's how you get to 500. So mosquito-borne diseases are really dangerous for this reason. And there's a number that you've probably heard of. We're going to go through some examples really quick. And the most classic mosquito-borne disease probably is malaria. It's been known for a very long time. The first written description of malaria goes back to about 500 BCE. Hippocrates, from which we get the Hippocratic Oath, wrote about malaria. We know it was malaria because malaria has a very distinctive fever cycle of of either 2 or 3 days. And so we call it tertian malaria because every third day you get a fever, or quartan malaria because every 4 days you get a fever, depending on the species of malaria that you get. And for that reason, we know without a doubt that he was talking about malaria 500 before the Common Era. Malaria is only found human malarias are only found in people. They're transmitted person to person. It is a major killer of people in Africa. It is the second biggest killer of children in Africa, second to diarrheal diseases. If you had to look at a single species, malaria is the number one killer because diarrhea is caused by a number of different pathogens. It is found, though, throughout the globe. While the biggest threat is in Africa, we have malaria throughout the globe. It's a little hard to see well enough on my slide probably, but those different colors on the map are dates when malaria was present. And what you can see is until 1946, malaria was present in the United States. In fact, the last cases actually probably finished in the early 1950s. Little known fact, the Centers for Disease Control is in Atlanta because it started out as the Center for Malaria Control. And it was in Atlanta because Atlanta was essentially the biggest urban area in the parts of the United States where malaria was endemic in the early 20th century. And so they put the CDC there to prevent malaria. We eliminated malaria from this country by the 1950s, but you can see that it persists in those purple areas essentially to today. Okay, and it's transmitted by one genus of mosquitoes. There's about 800 species, 900 species within that genus, but it's fairly specific to what mosquitoes can transmit it. Zika, dengue, and yellow fever are transmitted by the tiger type of mosquitoes that I mentioned before, and these are viral diseases. They are generally human-to-human transmitted, so they don't have much in the way of other animals involved. They can be from mild to deadly. Zika is actually mild in most people, but it does cause birth defects. And we really worry about anything that causes birth defects, of course, because children are the most vulnerable parts of our population, and a birth defect is a huge trauma for the lifetime of that person. We consider these diseases of globalization, so we saw massive spread from the 16th century for yellow fever to the 18th century, 19th century for dengue fever, to the 21st century for Zika. Yellow fever is one of the more deadly pathogens we know of. It kills about 40% of people who get it. It's luckily vaccine preventable and rare, although we do have outbreaks, even fairly large outbreaks in urban areas in South America and Africa to this day. It could come back. Encephalitis is some of our homegrown as well as exotic viruses that we have. And in this case, these are what we call zoonotic, meaning that they are found in animals and then they jump into people. We are, for the most part, accidental hosts. There's a number of different viruses, so I didn't bother to list them here. But while rare in people, they are devastating. They cause death, coma, paralysis, permanent vegetative state in people, and so quite severe consequences. One of the best examples of an encephalitis-causing virus that kind of acts like this, that's mosquito-borne, but found in animals, is West Nile fever. This one is exotic, although we have our own homegrown ones as well. We've been pretty lucky in North Carolina. West Nile has actually been pretty rare for us, whereas the rest of the country has had much higher cases, particularly out west, actually, once it spread across the United States. The vectors are mainly urban mosquitoes in the genus Culex, so particularly a risk for gardeners who are in urban areas and out there in the garden at dusk and dawn when these particular mosquitoes are most active. And it can cause a mild fever. Actually, in most people, it's pretty mild, but in people with impaired immune systems, particularly the elderly, it's likely to be more severe, including causing encephalitis. That means your brain swelling. Brain swelling is never a good idea, so very bad. All right, and then one I just like to share because it has really interesting biology, which is, and people don't always realize it, dog heartworm. Dog heartworm is an obligate, or it has to be transmitted by a mosquito. Dogs do not give heartworm to one another. They give it to a mosquito. The mosquito then transmits it to a dog. All right, so a good way to prevent it is prevent your dog from being bit. It's also interesting because many different mosquito species can transmit it. Although it's most common in dogs, it is also found in any carnivore. And it's often fatal in house cats pretty quickly, like within 6 months of infection. Dogs actually tolerate it pretty well, especially if they're big dogs. But it also can infect coyotes, wolves, raccoons, foxes, and big cats. It actually can be a problem in the Florida panther. So and also gets into zoo animals too. So it can be quite a threat. And it's actually fairly common in the southeastern United States. You can see that map, the hotter colors are where it's more common. In North Carolina, we see a pretty strong gradient. It's very common on the coastal plain and more common in rural counties, but gets pretty rare up in the mountains and then in places like Wake County and Mecklenburg County. Okay, so real quick, there hasn't been a ton of focus on the kind of backyard garden, smaller gardens, and mosquitoes. By the way, these are pictures from my garden. So I'm also a gardener, although I'm not a master gardener by any means, but I do really enjoy gardening. And so, but I did pull one study. It's a little bit hard to take exactly from this study, but things to look at where you see a positive value, that means that it's associated with greater abundance. I will warn you that this PC2, PC1, PC2 are a little harder to interpret quickly, and so we're going to kind of skip them. But this has to do with the kind of vegetative structure versus impervious surface at 1,000 meters versus at 60 meters. In general, what these mean is that in large part, the more vegetation there is, the more mosquitoes in the genus Aedes. Okay, so as well as a positive association with the amount of vegetation and the diversity of vegetation. Okay, now I couldn't find anything really specific to gardens, so this was actually scoring vacant lots for the amount of vegetation, but it was the closest peer-reviewed scientific literature I could find looking at mosquito abundance and kind of vegetative structure, etc. You'll see they also have separated culex. Culex are a genus that transmits West Nile virus, so this one is important. Aedes does transmit Zika, chikungunya, yellow fever, and dengue, but not in this country and not in Detroit, which is where this study was done. Okay. So that little bit of literature aside, I want to give you guys some tools about how to approach mosquito control in a kind of garden type of setting. And so I would say the first thing to do is ask these questions. What is the context? Are we looking at pest control or public health control? Like, is there an actual threat to human health, or is it just a nuisance? What species are the problem? If you can know that, really valuable information. What is the landscape like? And then what are the available resources? Okay, so first, the context of mosquito control. Separating these into public health and pest. Public health emergencies regarding mosquito-borne disease are rare in the United States. They do happen, but they are rare. In general, government agencies are going to be responsible. They are allowed to disregard regulations if an emergency is declared. And they're usually large area approaches. We're talking about fixed-winged aircraft aerially spraying for adult mosquitoes. Pest control, on the other hand, is common in the United States. It can be government agencies. These are usually very local government agencies or private. In North Carolina, the vast majority of mosquito pest control is private, up to the homeowner. In some cases, HOAs, but not commonly. There's only a few counties in North Carolina that do any pest mosquito control. They're mostly on the coast. Pest control should follow all regulations. I'm sure somebody at some point to this group has said the label is the law. The same is true for mosquito control. The label is the law. All right. But pest mosquito control is incredibly patchy in the United States. You get some counties that do it. Then within a county, you might have private homeowners doing it, others not doing it. A lot of factors go into this, and we're going to talk a little bit about that more in a sec. Okay. So in the public health context, we should remember that mosquitoes are an effective way of controlling the diseases I mentioned. All right. Because we know mosquito-borne diseases can be controlled by eliminating the mosquito, we consider all mosquito-borne disease preventable. All right. And that is important because from a public health standpoint, when you can prevent a disease, you do it if you can. So in that context, we really do encourage attacking mosquitoes when necessary. All right. It is unlikely to ever eliminate mosquitoes from this planet. I get that question a lot. Should we eliminate mosquitoes? And the answer is like, well, if you could eliminate the one species that causes malaria and kills children in Africa, you absolutely should. It's a moral imperative. However, if we could, we would, right? It just isn't going to happen. But robust public health is necessary at all times. A little bit different when we talk about pest control. Then you have to make some choices. Okay, so in addition to knowing the context, pest versus public health, the species biology really matters here. What do you want to control here? Because this will determine the habitat preference of the mosquito, particularly the larval habitat. And this can be an easy target for control. Eliminate the larval habitat, you never make the adult mosquitoes that are going to bite people. So often our number one target is larvae. However, adults are where the rubber meets the road, or rather where the mosquito proboscis meets the skin. And that's where we want to see control. So adult control is the other possible area. And then also determining how these species are interacting with vulnerable populations in the public health context. The landscape is also really important here. Are we talking about a rural landscape, a suburban landscape, or an urban landscape? This is actually really critical for the kind of control we might provide because the species are going to vary in these different contexts, as well as the scale of control that might be necessary and even the approaches. In an urban landscape, those mosquitoes that prefer containers are going to be the dominant pest mosquitoes. And things like tip and toss, seeking out containers, tossing them out to prevent larvae from growing, can be an effective way. In a more suburban and then especially a rural landscape, that may not be a viable option. And the mosquitoes that like those flooded waters are probably going to be more important. And they're not going to be easily controlled with, homeowners managing the larval environment. And in that case, adult control may be more warranted. Another important consideration for adult control is whether flowering plants are present. Most of the adult control approaches involve an adulticide that's going to kill an adult mosquito, and most things that kill adult mosquitoes will also kill pollinators. So it is against the label to spray flowering plants. Likewise, it is against the label to spray any food that will be consumed. And so if somebody is growing vegetables in their garden, then you cannot spray most products for adult control. Larval control is a little bit different, actually. You can still use those actually on some products. Okay, so this brings us to the question of what are the resources available? What are resources available to an individual homeowner, pest control operator, or government agencies? To the individual homeowner, probably the best thing, in my opinion, is avoiding mosquitoes while you're actually in the place where you're going to encounter them. You can wear protective clothing. I will say mosquitoes can bite through fairly thick clothes. So jeans, especially if they're tight to the skin, a mosquito can find a nice spot and get through that. But it's still a good idea. You can start by covering up. It has other advantages too. Obviously, you're avoiding sun, which has its own health issues as well. Wearing repellents on the skin, particularly DEET or picaridin, IR335, are really effective repellents. There are other repellents available as well. There are botanical repellents that are available. In general, nothing works quite as well as DEET. DEET can last as long as 6 hours with a single application of effective repellency, whereas the botanicals, maybe you get an hour, and so you have to repeatedly apply them. But if you're only going to be out in your garden for half an hour, then maybe that's a good choice. Kind of joking about the gardening at night, but most of our urban and suburban mosquitoes actually bite during the day or at dusk. You go out in the middle of the night, you'd be surprised how few mosquitoes are out there in our context here in North Carolina. It's not true in Africa, where the malaria vectors are mostly nocturnal, but for most of ours, actually, you may be able to avoid them by changing when you do things, their time of day. So other approaches that homeowners could do, but often pest control operators do is spraying an adulticide around the edges of a property. This is spraying usually a pyrethroid called bifenthrin. It will stay on vegetation for up to 21 days. It is a contact insecticide, so when a mosquito lands on that vegetation that's been treated, it will kill the mosquito. However, pyrethroids are general insecticides, meaning that anything else that lands on that vegetation will likely take in a dose that could kill it. It depends on the size of the insect, as well as the dose, as well as the susceptibility of that insect. But this is the most common approach to backyard spraying, okay? The law says don't spray edible plants or flowers. However, the compliance and enforcement with the label is likely variable. I don't want to get anybody in trouble, but in my observations, which I've done with companies, there is, a loose interpretation, particularly of the flowering plants part of this. Some flowers are hard to see. Some are greenish. So, generally they go back and they spray, any vegetation. They're not allowed to spray any structures, just vegetation and the kind of usually the surrounding vegetation that many yards are bordered with. A quick note about natural pesticides or 25Bs. These are minimally regulated products because they are EPA exempt. They're considered of low risk by the EPA. The one downside with this is that they are often not tested for efficacy. So they will make claims about controlling mosquitoes. This is usually based on fairly limited evidence, usually just studies in the lab that show that they can kill a mosquito if a mosquito contacts them. Usually this may or may not translate to effectiveness in the yard. And I will note that there is usually nothing special about these products to make them mosquito specific. Indeed, making any insecticide specific to one type of pest is incredibly difficult. And for that reason, just because they smell better or they are 25B or they're considered green doesn't necessarily mean they aren't also killing other insects. In fact, this is an area that really demands more scientific study than it's received. It's something I feel guilty about not investigating in my lab yet. Maybe someday we'll get to that. Other really interesting things, and this kind of goes back to the private homeowner, although often they're installed by pest control agencies or pest control operators, I should say, are spray systems. And in this case, people are installing spray nozzles in areas of their yard that they wish to keep mosquito free, and they turn on the system and they spray either a pyrethroid or a repellent. A pyrethroid is usually it's not usually bifenthrin, but permethrin. The most expensive ones and somewhat effective ones are a permethrin PBO blend. The PBO actually irritates the mosquitoes, and what it does, it makes them more active, and then the permethrin kills them. The repellency systems are kind of interesting. They're a little bit newer on the market. Things like Thermosil use allanthrin, which is also a pyrethroid, but it has a strong repellent property. So instead of directly killing the mosquito, it's driving them away. For reasons maybe we'll get to in a second, that might be better. Government agencies actually adopt a variety of other approaches. They're usually doing area-wide control. They have trucks, helicopters, airplanes, They also bring educational campaigns. So you can see the little photo there is some poor worker for a mosquito control district dressed up as, I don't know, Mozzie or Bitey or whatever, the mosquito, to go and educate people. You would be a bit shocked at the kind of budgets that some mosquito control districts have. None in North Carolina are kind of some of the big players out there, but in Florida, New Jersey, Texas, and California all have very robust mosquito control. It's usually funded through local tax bases, like a millage at a local level. Sometimes they're even not even a whole county, but within a county, particularly in coastal areas where the inside of the county is poor, but the edge of the county on the coast is wealthy. They'll pay for mosquito control. They have budgets in the millions to tens of millions of dollars. I have a lot of friends who work in this space, and I mean, at meetings, they tell me about their latest helicopter, not just their new one, or not just the one that they just got, but the third one that they got that does this and that. So, there's a lot of actually money in it. And so they can actually do quite a bit. And they're, for the most part, very responsible. They're very aware of environmental damages that mosquito control can do. Nevertheless, they have a charge to control mosquitoes. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is the reliance on chemical insecticides invariably leads to resistance in any pest population. And this is an area of active research in my lab. So the one bit of kind of my lab's research I'd like to share with you looks at resistance, and it looks at it in the tiger mosquito in the backyard environment, which is really interesting because instead of large-scale spraying like you might see in agricultural settings for pests on agriculture or pests in gardens, or the large-scale mosquito control setting like you see with government agencies, Wake County has zero mosquito control. In fact, there is no public mosquito anything in the county whatsoever. So it's entirely driven by the private individual homeowner choice to spray for mosquitoes in their backyards. And so with that context, we look at socioeconomic factors that drive the evolution of insecticide resistance in North Carolina. Luckily for me, I've been studying this mosquito since I arrived in North Carolina in 2012 and saving mosquitoes in a very systematic way when we do field work on them in Wake County over the last almost decade now. And so we have mosquitoes from 2016 all the way through, I should have updated this, we have them through 2025. All right, and what we have seen is the change in the prevalence of a mutation in a gene, and that mutation confers resistance to pyrethroid insecticides in these mosquitoes. So I know that was like a lot to take in. All right, that mutation we call KDR, or knockdown resistance, because essentially when you spray these mosquitoes that have this mutation, they don't get knocked down by the pesticide. And we've seen the prevalence of this mutation go up from 0 in 2016, 0 in 2017, a few in 2018, those are those individual dots, to a consistent rise all the way through 2023 to about 40% of the mosquitoes now carry this resistance gene. Okay. One of the interesting things about this is when we look at our historical data, some years we did a lot of sampling and some we didn't. That was for other projects. We didn't even know this was going to happen. We just save all of our mosquitoes in the freezer. And so later on, we can go back and look at their DNA and see these patterns. And one thing that you can see in these maps of Wake County is that, yes, the prevalence rose up. The darker the dot, the higher the prevalence, all the way up to some sites where every mosquito we caught was carrying the mutation for resistance. But you can also see that there's some variation spatially across the landscape in 2023. The dots that are yellow essentially have no resistance, and the dots that are dark, purple to black, have high levels of resistance. Right? And when we looked at the individual characteristics of these locations, which are essentially a house in a neighborhood, we found that the wealthier the home, the more likely they were to carry these resistant genes. And the newer the home, the less likely they were to carry these resistance genes. That is to say, the older homes had more resistance, and the wealthier homes had more resistance. And you can think about why that is, but given that all exposure, no, most exposure of these mosquitoes to the pesticide comes when an individual homeowner makes a choice to pay about $50 a month to spray their yard, we suspect that there's two things going on. One, people with the ability to pay, everybody hates mosquitoes, right? So people who have the financial ability to pay are spraying their homes, right? And where we find the most abundant mosquitoes, which we know from other studies are in older neighborhoods, then people are more motivated to pay for it because it's more of a problem. So kind of cool. This work is ongoing with various wrinkles and additions. We have a couple papers that are in review right now at scientific journals that essentially describe the patterns I just shared. And I see my time is just about up, which is kind of perfect because I will just note that there are other things that bite you in in the gardening context. Probably the most important ones are ticks, particularly if you're in an area with wooded areas as well as yard and garden kind of areas. There are sandflies, although they're very rare. Actually, one thing that we get in my yard in suburban Raleigh are no-see-ums. That's the one on the upper right. They're called no-see-ums because these are incredibly tiny flies, and you literally don't see them often. And if you feel a bite, and it hurts when they bite actually, even though they're really small, and then you welt up afterwards in your garden, particularly the shoulder seasons, early spring to mid-spring, and then in the fall, it's probably an no-see-um. And then finally, deer flies and horse flies, you'll see them, but they can, of course, be a big problem in certain areas, particularly near wetlands. So just thank you to my lab. We don't always go to the bar there, but that is a picture from one time we did go to the bar to celebrate. Actually, it was a bowling alley, so we bowled, not drank. And then thank all the funders that help support my work. And then I'm happy to answer any questions. So thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Michael. We do have a few questions that have come in through chat, so I'm going to run through them pretty quickly. There was a question about mosquito dunks, which you didn't touch on, and whether they would harm dragonfly larvae. The mosquito dunks that contain BT.
In large part, they seem pretty safe for for dragonfly larvae. They are formulated in that way to be somewhat specific, although a big dose of BT in any insect gut would probably harm it. I do not know, if a dragonfly nymph eats a mosquito larvae that has itself ingested BT, could it get a lethal dose? I don't think that's been investigated that I know of, so that would be a risk. BT is quite safe for vertebrates, so we don't think that fish and amphibians are likely to get the kind of dose that would kill them when you use BT. It's very effective in containers where you can't dump them out or you don't want to, like a bird bath. You can put a dunk in there and it'll last 30 days and really is very effective at killing all the mosquito larvae. In those more complicated environments, like a pond that has dragonfly larvae, I don't know. I will say that in large part, I don't think of ponds as being a major source of most mosquitoes because of the intact predator communities that are going to do a pretty good job of controlling them. It's interesting that mosquito I mentioned that digs its siphon into plants, we actually think that's an anti-predator behavior or adaptation so that they don't have to go up to the surface to feed. And we actually see those in more complicated, in bodies of water that have more complex food webs where you have vegetation. And so those may still produce a lot. And if you're in a rural area with a pond with lots of vegetation, this is where knowing what species are actually the most common pests would be really helpful for the mosquito control person to give good advice. I rambled a little, sorry, but I'm a professor. What can I say? We ramble.
And there was a related question. So I don't know if there's a kind of campaign out now to have these, to put out a bucket in your yard. Like it's called the bucket of doom or has other names, where you put the bucket, you fill it with water, you put some leaves and stuff in it. So it becomes a place that attracts mosquitoes, and then you add mosquito dunks.
Yeah.
Do you see that as an effective strategy for homeowners?
I'm definitely a by any means necessary when it comes to mosquito control. Like sometimes I get questions like, you know, what about GMO mosquitoes? And my answer is always yes and. Like these all have to be complementary. So I think as long as you can be diligent about it, then great. I think that anything you can do to help reduce the population. I mean, even setting out the same bucket and just religiously emptying it before 7 days hits will kill all the mosquitoes. They won't survive if you dump them out into the ground. And so even that could be effective, but certainly putting the dunk in is a great idea. I'm trying to think, there have been some studies that have looked at whether the dunks kind of become repellent to mosquitoes laying eggs. And I actually don't think that people have showed that yet. So that suggests it will work. Yeah.
I think I'll do one more question that's come in a couple of times, and then we'll move on to Matt and Mike and our BOLOs. But so a couple of people have asked about like how far do mosquitoes move away from where they hatch?
Yeah.
And what does this mean? Like mosquitoes are breeding in your neighbor's yard, and for those controls systems you talked about that are spraying, like can't mosquitoes just fly away?
Yeah. I mean, I think like certainly the spatial repellent systems, yes, mosquitoes would fly away. But to answer the initial question, it depends on the mosquito. We have fairly good documentation that salt marsh mosquitoes can fly maybe as much as 15 miles away from the salt marsh
Wow.
and then return to the salt marsh because that's where they have to lay their eggs. Whereas the container tiger mosquito, like pictured there, probably rarely travels more than 250 yards away from where it emerged. They tend to stay pretty local, maybe as far as a kilometer, but not much more than that. Same with the Culex mosquitoes. I will say we did a study looking at kind of knock-on effect of backyard spraying, and you definitely benefit in terms of reducing mosquitoes if your neighbor sprays their yard. Yeah.
All right.
Good.
Well, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there for
Sure.
time, but you will see there are quite a few other questions in the chat.
I can try to answer them.
Oh, that'd be fantastic. That'd be wonderful. We really appreciate you joining us today, Michael, and sharing your wisdom, your knowledge on this very important topic for all of us. It was extremely helpful. So there were also lots of compliments you'll see coming in the chat and appreciation for your program.
Well, thank
So
all of you. I appreciate this.
absolutely. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Matt and Mike, who are going to give us our BOLOs, our Be on the Lookout pest and disease issues for the coming month.
Matt, we never talked. Hello, everyone, first of all. But Matt, we never talked about who was going first, but why don't you start and I'll finish?
Sure. Continue with the critters. And thank you, Michael. That was really great, really informative, and thanks for presenting on a really interesting subject. I'm sure most people here didn't know that mosquitoes are flies. That's one of my favorite like facts about them. It was just kind of interesting. Of course, I'm a fly lover, but I like other weird stuff. So, all right. So let's talk about some bolos, some critters to be on the lookout for. Hopefully everyone can see this. Can everyone see this? I'm assuming. All right. Well, let's talk about some things you're going to see in October, late September, early October, or mid-October as we move into that month. So there's still going to be arthropods around as long as it's kind of warmish out and mild. We're going to see some things. These were all critters I took photos of in October over the years, and so they're out and about still, of course, as with the mosquitoes as well. As it starts to get cooler, we're going to start to see a lot of home invaders. In fact, I was just up in the mountains this past weekend and at my parents' house, and as we were working on the house outside, other than being attacked or swarmed by hummingbirds, there were tons of brown marmorated stink bugs and other stink bugs flying toward the house looking for places to overwinter. So stink bugs are a really big one that overwinters adults, and so you'll have these brown marmorated stink bugs entering the home looking to hide away over the winter and hibernate, where they become a big nuisance in the home. They can stink and they can stain things, and they're kind of just a nuisance. We also get some other true bugs related to stink bugs like kudzu bugs and box elder bugs that again overwinter as adults, so they need to find a place to rest and hibernate, and so they may enter homes and become a nuisance. Another thing are some flies. So some species like cluster flies and such will sometimes, many fly species will overwinter as adults as well. And so they'll enter the homes to hibernate. And cluster flies are house fly, a little bit bigger, sometimes blowfly relatives that are kind of usually dull colored with these crinkly golden setae on the thorax. So that's how you can identify this group of flies. Now, one thing that gardeners like and a lot of people love because they're pretty, but can be a nuisance are the ladybugs. Again, this is a group that overwinters as adults, and so they're going to have to find a place to hibernate. They will enter homes, and in fact, when I was in the mountains, I was talking to people there too, and they talk about the stink bugs and the ladybugs entering the homes. We'll get the harlequin or Asian multicolored ladybugs, the Harmonia axaritis, which are very common in the state and overwinter in homes, as well as the another species of ladybug, the seven-spotted ladybug. And these can cause staining on skin. They can even bite. And kind of a pretty painful bite, actually. This is what we usually like them for, is munching on aphids and things like that with those bites. But when they're biting humans, it's not so fun. And so be on the lookout for these. And then finally, the wasps. So at this time of year, the social wasps, the paper wasps, hornets, yellow jackets, all that stuff, are the nests are getting about to be the biggest they are going to be this year, and that's when they start to produce males and new queens. These will go out and mate with each other, kind of mix out in the environment between from nests. They will mate, the males will die, and the queens, these new queens that have just mated, will then overwinter and emerge next spring to create the nest. And so again, they're going to enter the homes and be looking for places to hide. While the rest of the colony will die out, the previous queen and all the workers and males will die out at the end of the year as it gets cooler. And so let's see. So these are all things to be aware of. Now, you might ask, okay, what do I do to prevent this? Unfortunately, they're really common in the environment. We've also cleared a lot of forests and natural areas around our homes, so this reduces the amount of environment that they usually would overwinter in. So these organisms classically would overwinter in leaf litter, in tree hollows, or under bark, places like that. In fact, peeling bark in the winter, you'll sometimes find sleeping wasps. But since we've cut a lot of those down and developed areas, our homes are a good place, and attics and walls and places like that are going to be invaded. So if you want to prevent them, the best way to do it is to shore up your house, make sure the gaps in the siding, around the doors and windows, stuff like that, are well sealed. The eaves are well sealed as much as you can. But if you can't, unfortunately, you may just have to deal with these pests coming in and spending their winter with you. And again, in the spring, we're going to see the outflux of them, and we'll talk about that when that time comes. Now, speaking of wasps, I am still getting a lot of messages about large hornets, people thinking that they are the northern or Asian or murder hornets, these giant hornets. But right over here to the right, we have the European hornet, which is well established in the US. It's been here for almost 200 years. And just another primer on how to tell the difference between these large wasps. Right now, we are still seeing cicada killers active. These are large native hunting wasps that hunt cicadas. The European hornet, like I said, is here. It's a social wasp. It's going to start to create males and new queens, like the paper wasps and the yellow jackets and such. But these two types of wasps on the lateral sides, on the other sides, are not here in the state. This is the northern giant hornet, or what they call the murder hornet. This was apparently eradicated from the Pacific Northwest, and we are not likely to see it in North Carolina. But the very similar looking European hornet is very common. This is what I'm getting a lot of emails about and a lot of calls about. Note, the best way to identify them is that the European hornet has reddish brown on its head and large eyes. The eyes are only about the same distance from the back of the head, as well as these spots or teardrops near their stripes, whereas the giant hornets have a completely yellow head with very small eyes that are about twice or about half the size of the distance between the back of the head, and very clear stripes that don't have those little kind of teardrops or spots. Now, this wasp here, the yellow-legged hornet, we are looking out for because there is a population that seems to be pretty established in Savannah, Georgia, and around in South Carolina too, and over the border there between South Carolina and Georgia. It's a bit smaller than the other wasps, but it has these very pale yellow feet, or the tarsi. It's mostly dark with kind of the tip of the abdomen being lighter. So be on the lookout for that, but we haven't seen any sightings of that yet in the state so far. Okay, on to a couple other things. So
Matt,
you're going to
may I interrupt with a question? So
Sure.
why are we concerned about the yellow-legged hornet?
Well, so the yellow-legged hornet is really, we're not too concerned about human safety. They're going to be just as bad or whatever as kind of other larger yellow jackets or hornet type insects. To humans, they're not really too much of a concern. But the yellow-legged hornet and the northern giant hornet are the two species that are considered bee killers. And so they will destroy beehives. And so especially for apiculturalists and people with beehives, these can be an issue. Now, luckily, they're fairly large. So one way people can strategy to use is use an excluder. So you can put a wire screen in front of the hive so that the bees can get in, but these hornets are too big to get into. But again, we're not seeing it yet in North Carolina, but that's the one main concern that we have. Of course, we're always concerned with exotic species displacing native species and whatnot. And if there is a chance they could be stinging, then obviously people are a little worried. But yeah, functionally, the European hornet is here is very similar to these other ones. And people can go a long time without seeing them, and then they see them, they see a large wasp, and they call me and say, "Oh, I found it, and I've never seen this thing before." They're just out and about, and maybe you just haven't seen it in your life. And I rarely see them out there when I'm out, but every once in a while I will. And this year has been a pretty good year for the hornets in general. Okay, so another thing, it would be larger arthropods are hanging on. These, a lot of the species that have one generation per year, this is the time of year when they've grown after, spring emerging, growing through the season, and they become the largest in the fall when they're going to be big and mating and stuff like that. So you have mantises becoming the biggest now. This is 1.75 mantises from campus. This female is wearing the male like a backpack. Then the classic, what people think about praying mantises biting off the heads. This is our native Carolina mantid, which is a little bit smaller than the Chinese and other mantises. We're seeing a lot of orb weavers too. So these large, heavy-bodied spiders that build the orb webs, these kind of classic spider webs. And you'll notice that you didn't see them earlier in the year. They were around, but they're very small. They're growing, and now we're seeing the big ones as they become adults. Some other things, I often see these march flies in the genus Penthetria. They're one of my favorite flies because you almost like clockwork in October, we start to see them. The males have these very large eyes, the females smaller eyes. Just very interesting species, but completely harmless to humans and or actually any animals. The larvae feed on detritus and the adults don't feed. You may also see, I mentioned this I think last time, but you may see soldier beetles and the larvae. The soldier beetles are very common on goldenrod. They have these very leathery, soft wings. But we sometimes see people sending in images of the larvae, these velvety black larvae that crawling around abundantly on driveways and sidewalks and sometimes getting into homes as well. And finally, have you seen the Joro spider this year? So this is another large orb weaving spider that it was first recorded in 2015 in Atlanta, Georgia, and is now well established. And again, they're very small throughout the year. They may balloon up here to North Carolina, and they've even been found as far up north as I think New Jersey or places like that where they can balloon very long distances. And again, they're very small through most of the year. You don't notice them, but this is the time of year when you guys start to notice them. So, be on the lookout for these. There's not much we're doing with them. They are basically harmless, and they're very timid. They are very large and scary looking, and create very large webs that can be a nuisance. But they're harmless, and once the winter comes, you won't see them again till next year in the fall, if they even get to your area. And if you're on the coast, or even I got somebody sent me a photo of one of these from campus here in Raleigh. You have the native golden silk spiders, which are a very close relative of the Joro spider, and so people live with them. They're not harming people. Again, the Joro spider I think is going to be more of a nuisance with all the webbing and all that stuff rather than a medical danger, because they're just not aggressive and not apt to bite, and even bites are very, very mild, much milder than a bee sting even. So with that, I'm going to stop and let Mike present some pathogen and disease bolos.
Thank you, Matt. I was seeing there was a question from Mitch Smith about a gnat invasion.
Gnat invasion this year. It might be local to you. Mitch, I don't know if
Yes.
you want to elaborate?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you for that report. I'm here with our Edgecombe County Master Gardeners, and we all in agreement. We seem to be experiencing more gnat pressure locally. And I know these are not of the same magnitude as they are down in South Georgia and Florida, but Has anyone complained to you about so many gnats this year? Can you speak to why that might be the case?
So this is where identification comes into play because gnat is a generic term for any small kind of midge-like or fragile-bodied fly. And different gnats, a lot of gnats, it really depends on what you're talking about. So the first step is getting it ID'd for sure. Are these very little tiny flies that fly around the face? Are they large kind of ganglia flies that kind of around lights at night? Those are kind of, yeah,
Certainly around the face,
little tiny
very
black
small.
flies, little very, yeah.
Yes.
So those are probably eye gnats. Those are chloropid flies or frit flies. So this is very different than what you would think of like gnats that or midges that come from water. They develop in grasses and place and things like that. And really, unless we study these species throughout time, it's really difficult to predict why certain, weather or other types of events might cause them to be more abundant or less. Their hosts might be more abundant or more healthy, and so you're producing more of these insects. But there are some look up. There's a nice paper that came out a couple years ago about in Georgia. They're really a big issue in southern Georgia, and so look up eye gnats and Hippolades is the genus. I can try and find that paper and I'll put a link into here. So, but they may have some information in that paper, but I haven't gotten a lot of calls about that particularly. But if you want to pursue that, feel free to, we can submit some samples or get some photos and we can try and figure out what might be going on.
Thank you so much. We will do it. Thanks for the report.
All right. Let me present a set of non-critter bolos. I moved this one up this year to October and said I usually talk about this in October and alert people for the kind of November, December timeframe, but I moved it up this year. And I do like to emphasize that this shedding of the oldest needles on, especially arborvitaes, but we'll see it on some other things like the Chamaecyparis and other relatives, is just a natural phenomenon. In the picture on the right there, you can see an arborvitae and a maple doing the same thing. They're shedding their oldest foliage. Well, the maple, of course, shedding all of its foliage for the year, but this is just the turnover. So even though they are evergreen, it doesn't mean each individual needle is immortal. And I also use this as a segue to remind folks that on our webpage, we do have a thing called useful links. One of the items in that set is our identification and decision guide for cypress problems. So particularly leylands and arborvitaes, also some mention of cryptomeria. And it's a key where you, and by answering a series of different questions, will lead you hopefully to an answer, at least some hypotheses as to what may be going wrong with these trees that do seem to have a lot of problems in our landscape. So keep in mind that we do have that resource on our website. A quick BOLO quiz. Let me see if I'm able. No, we can't do a quiz online on this because I don't know a way to have them allow multiple choices. So just on your own, see which of these symptoms would be ones that you would associate with boxwood blight, which is something that we'll be on the lookout for actually pretty much all year. And so would it be dieback of sections of the shrub, dark leaf spots, dark streaks on green twigs, defoliation, galls on the roots, and yellowing of foliage? So just quickly note to yourself which of these things you think would be indicative of boxwood blight. And I'll give you a hint that there are 3. And my rule of thumb is always, if you see any 2 of them, then you've got a pretty good idea that you actually have boxwood blight. Although if you send it into the lab here, if it needs a confirmation, we'll look for the causal fungus under the microscope. And we're a little bit short on time, so I'm going to go ahead and reveal the answer. It is B, C, and D, the dark leaf spots, the dark streaks on the green twigs, and defoliation. And a good example here in this photograph of a sample that came in a while back. Now you can see the heavy defoliation, generally from the lower part upward. And you don't see the leaf spots in this picture, but you can kind of make out some of the dark streaks on the green twigs there. Continuing with our tree and shrub bolos for the month of October coming up, besides boxwood blight, we'll want to look for boxwood stem canker, which is typically yellowing of the foliage on individual branches, but the leaves do not fall off. They hang onto the stem. Then you would cut under the bark at the base of where that foliage is yellowing and look for the almost black discoloration under the bark there, and you've got a pretty good idea. You have boxwood stem canker, also known as boxwood dieback. And our boxwoods, of course, suffer from a lot of problems below ground too, such as root rot, Phytophthora root rot, and 3 different types of nematodes. Hydrangea, of course, Cercospora leaf spot. We've been seeing it for a while now, and we will continue to see that, along with a couple of other possibilities there on your hydrangeas. Indian hawthorn, Entomosporium leaf spot, pictured there in the lower right. All of these are fungal problems. With rose, armillaria root rot, which of course can be on many different kinds of woody plants. Also rose rosette, I'll show a slide of that in a moment. Black spot and what we used to call Cercospora leaf spot, but then the fungus was changed to Passiflora and then now changed again to Rosus ferella. And here's the picture of rose rosette. You get the elongation of the new growth, you get the witch's broom, you get the red retention of the red juvenile color, and in advanced cases, hyperthorniness. And one of the key things to look for is if you see a branch that is actually thicker than the cane that it came out of. That is, along with the hyperthorniness, if either of those are present, then that's a for sure diagnosis there of rose rosette. Some of the other things could be caused by other factors. These trees, I walked by them again or drove by them just on Sunday in my neighborhood, and every year they seem to go bare like this. So our ornamental cherries will very often have a lot of defoliation this time of year because of a couple of different fungal infections. Most in this particular example, the photograph here, it's mostly cherry leaf spot or blue mariella with also some Passiflora circumcissa on it. So these will cause a lot of leaf drop in advance of what should be the normal fall season. Other tree and shrub BOLOs, Phytophthora and armillaria root rot on many different hosts. We've been seeing armillaria lately headed on a rhododendron not too long ago, and of course on arborvitae. Many different kinds of trees and shrubs will have powdery mildews on them. Our oaks, you could still be seeing bacterial leaf scorch until the leaves drop off for the fall, Tubacia leaf spot as well. And now is the time of year when you're more likely to see the fruiting bodies. These look like a loaf of bread at the base of the tree because of these fungus Pseudoinonotus dryadius causing a root and butt rot there. It's called the weeping polypore because in the mornings you'll see these kind of droplets accumulating on the surface of the fruiting body. Internal browning again, or that shedding of needles in arborvitaes. Hemlock, you may see out in the mountains the Rosalinea blight occurring, so be on the lookout for that. Not something we see very often. In spruce, a little bit more common would be the Rhizosphere needle cast, causing especially the lower needles to drop off on the older needles. Now here I will try to, I've lost my, let's see if I'm able, no, I guess I'm not able to post a quiz. Here we go, polls. So what do you think is going on this blue star, this Amsonia? Is it Cercospora leaf spot, Colosporium rust, edema, spider mites, or is it just my thumb? And launch that poll. Give folks a few seconds. This was a, excuse me, I'm trying to think of where exactly this came from. It was Durham County, Orange County, somewhere out in that direction. All right, interesting. So we got Cercospora leaf spot as the number 1, but very close to the answer B, which was the correct one. This is a Colosporium rust. It looks a little bit maybe like edema or spider mites, and yes, that is my thumb in there. But the thing that we want to focus on here, of course, is the rust rather than my thumb. And it's probably the species Colosporium apocynaceum, right? because of the family name, you can make that connection. But you'll also be seeing this time of year other Coleosporium rusts on hosts like Goldenrod. And I want to emphasize that too, because I think we're going to hear a little bit about Goldenrod, and ironwood would be another one you would see Coleosporium rust on. These are interesting in that when they alternate with pines, causing a needle rust on pines. Very quickly, turfgrass, be on the lookout for fairy ring on all kinds of turf grasses, large patch on warm season turf species, so-called because it is a patch and it is large. Leaf spot by Bipolaris or Drexlera on bluegrass and Bermuda grass, and rusts on several different turf species. Also, you may see it on some ornamental grasses. I believe sometime in the fall, a year or two ago, noticing it on the switchgrass planted out by our student center here. And for other BOLOs, I refer you to the BOLO menu item on our website. And turn it back over to our Master Gardener program.
All right, thank you, Mike. I am happy to talk about our Plant These for Pollinators feature plant this month. And of course, this is an ongoing feature in Plants, Pests, and Pathogens that we've been looking at each month. A specific plant that is a great resource for pollinators and something that will work in our landscapes across North Carolina and the Southeast. And we are featuring Goldenrod this month, which there is no plant, I think, that really says it's fall more than Goldenrod. These are perennials that are in the genus Solidago. There's quite a few species. Just in North Carolina, we have 61 different species and subspecies, depending on whose classification system you look at, because there are quite a few variations out there. And then even in the southeastern, if you expand to the southeastern United States, you're looking at over 100 or around 100 of those species and subspecies. So as you can imagine, with that many different species of Solidago, they're going to be adapted to different habitats. So you're likely to find Goldenrod in sunny sites. There are some that are even adapted for shade. There are species that grow in moist and wet soils, and others that grow on well-drained and dry soils. You're going to see them on roadsides, at the edge of the woods. You're going to see them in the woods, some of these shade species, in wetland areas, in any kind of abandoned place where they can get a hold, because some of them, especially the species you see in the picture here, the tall goldenrod, Solidago altissima, are some of those primary colonizers that tend to come in to land that's kind of been left, like recently logged areas, abandoned pastures, just abandoned fields in general. So they do have these bright golden yellow flowers that really announce the arrival of fall, although some of them do start blooming as early as midsummer. And other species go right on blooming right through till frost. They are in the aster family, the Asteraceae. So what we look at and think of as the bloom as a panicle, and it's composed of hundreds of individual flowers. And that's one of the reasons it's such a wonderful resource for pollinators and other insects, because each flower has pollen and nectar that can sustain, especially the pollen for our bees. They're collecting it for their young, and then the nectar supporting all different types of insects. So the flowers are such a reliable source, and beekeepers really rely on the goldenrod flow of nectar at this time of the year to help their hives strengthen and collect the resources they need to go through the winter. Also, many of our native bees really rely on it. Species like the monarch butterfly in its fall migration you're likely to see it on goldenrod. It's an important flowering species to support monarchs in that migration. With our native bees, I should mention too, we also have some specialist feeders. So we have some bees that really just focus and specialize on feeding on Solidago or goldenrod. So it's important for both those specialized feeders and then for our more general feeders. So you'll see all kinds of bumblebees on them, as well as various wasps, flies, beetles, butterflies, and moths. And then after the flowers are gone and the seeds are formed, songbirds will feed on the seeds, as well as caterpillars that may be feeding on the foliage. And these goldenrods support so many species that Doug Tallamy, in his book Nature's Best Hope, refers to the genus Solidago, so the goldenrod genus, is without a doubt one of nature's greatest gifts to animal life, just because of the sheer variety of insects and critters it supports, and then the things that rely on those insects. So it's a very important species in our ecosystems. And one really important point I want to make is those goldenrod flowers come out this time of year. You can probably tell by my scratchy voice, I have allergies. Many of you probably have allergies, and it is not the goldenrod. The goldenrod is what we see and often associated with the onset of these allergy symptoms, but it's actually ragweed. What you can see in the picture here is very inconspicuous. It's just a green plant with little green flowers that don't actually have petals. It is wind pollinated. So those plants that really tend to activate hay fever are these wind pollinated plants, because they make copious amounts of pollen that's very lightweight and stays suspended in the air for long amounts of time. So what we find with ragweed is a single ragweed plant can make 1 billion pollen grains. So that's pretty phenomenal. And those pollen grains can remain airborne for several days and travel for miles. We've had some, depending on where you are in the state, but it's been quite dry the last several weeks and windy weather. So it's really mixing that ragweed pollen in our atmosphere and keeping it out there. On the other hand, goldenrod flowers with those golden petals, that color is there to attract insects. So one thing you tend to see with wind pollinated plants is they don't have showy flowers. They don't even have petals. They don't need them, because flower petals are an adaptation to generally attract pollinators. So the goldenrods have those colorful petals that attract the pollinators, and their pollen is relatively large and sticky. So it sticks to our bees and pollinators, but it's too heavy to be carried on the wind. So unless you went directly up to a goldenrod and kind of inhaled the blooms, you're not likely to be exposed to goldenrod pollen. It is the ragweed that is doing it to us. And those are actually the flowers at the top. You might not even recognize them as flowers. And ragweed leaves are divided, whereas goldenrod always have entire leaves. So it's quite a different looking plant. And this, even though people know, and a lot of advertisers will say no, that ragweed is causing the problem, they actually don't know what ragweed looks like. So this was just a quick online search of ragweed that came up with pictures like this. So a lot of times people, particularly in ads and like allergy specialists and medications, and I even check some of the pollen count apps that tell us what the current pollen count is. And no surprise, ragweed is currently high. They're showing pictures of goldenrod and talking about ragweed pollen. So all of these images that show goldenrod but talk about ragweed are misrepresenting this wonderful plant. So just remember, goldenrod is not what's contributing to the allergies. It's the ragweed, which is a very different looking plant. It's a very different plant. It's an annual. It's actually also quite important to wildlife. So it's not to say it's a bad plant. It just activates allergies for a lot of us. So for goldenrod, it being such an important plant and supporting so many different types of pollinators and other insects, it's a great thing to add to our yards and to our natural areas. And so, we mentioned there's 61 species. A lot of those are not really well suited to residential landscape beds, where you want something that's going to stay relatively tidy and contained, because quite a few of them do spread vigorously by rhizomes. Again, I've already mentioned the tall goldenrod, which is in the background here. And so they would quickly take over small landscape beds. But they are wonderful in natural areas and meadows and spaces where they can run, and you want large areas of plants to fill in. So that's where you could use those spreaders. The other thing you see about a lot of our native species is actually when you show them any kindness, you give them any water, any compost in the soil, any nutrients, they just get really floppy. They grow large and they fall out. So they actually will often have a much nicer habit when they're growing in this more natural site that you can see, where they're mixing with grasses like little bluestem and split-beard bluestem and some of our other grasses. The competition keeps them smaller. Just the tough condition keeps them compact and standing upright. So the one in the foreground here that's quite showy is called gray goldenrod or old field goldenrod, Solidago numeralis, and it often does just show up. And I will say this is a meadow area in my landscape None of these were planted. They all just showed up on their own. So they do come in. If you leave an area, they will come and make themselves at home. But there are some that are excellent landscape plants. So if you don't have this large area where you can just allow goldenrods to do their thing, there are species that you can seek out and varieties you can seek out that make wonderful additions to your landscape that also are going to provide all these benefits for pollinators and other insects. And probably the best one, I would say, in the Southeast, in my gardening experience, is the fireworks goldenrod. This is a selection of Solidago rugosa, which is sometimes called the wrinkle leaf goldenrod because it has kind of a crinkly leaf. And it is a wonderful landscape plant. It was actually discovered here in North Carolina near Wilson at a plant rescue that was being led by the North Carolina Botanical Gardens. They helped introduce it along with a nursery at the time that was called Niche Gardens. So it is truly, this cultivar is actually a North Carolina native in that it was found right here in North Carolina and has become probably the most popular landscape goldenrod that you'll find and is pretty readily available. It's going to be best in sun, but it will take part shade and it'll grow quite happily in moist or well-drained soil. It might be a little stunted in very, very sandy sites. So I would, if you have really sandy soil, I would try to put it in an area that at least gets some extra moisture or add some organic matter to the soil. But in clay, it's just perfectly happy. You can see it has these very long sprays of arching golden flowers. They just cover the plant at this time of the year, even earlier, starting in August through September. The whole plant is around 2 to 4 feet tall and 3 to 4 feet wide. It does have short rhizomes, and it's kind of one of these carpet forming plants. So if you plant the initial plant and it's about, say 8 inches across, next year it'll probably be 16 inches across. And the next year after that, it might be 24 inches across. So it's kind of this expanding mat each year. It's not sending offshoots like feet away from the mother plant. It's staying quite confined to this spreading kind of carpet area, which means it's actually quite easy to propagate by division. And if you have it in your landscape, you could certainly divide it and move it around after a few years. And just a handy thing, the basal foliage, so the foliage that grows really low to the ground, stays evergreen in winter. So you always know where it is. It doesn't just completely disappear during the winter time. Just some other pictures of the flowers up here, a close-up where you can see all these small flowers. So there's hundreds, even thousands of blossoms on every stem. And it produces lots and lots of them. So there are some other goldenrods that you could definitely seek out for your landscape. If you have shade, things like the wreath goldenrod, Solidago cassia is a shade-tolerant variety that'll take moisture, dry soil. In the picture here, we have kind of that classic-looking goldenrod. This one's actually anise goldenrod, Solidago odora. The foliage is quite anise-scented if you kind of crush it up and smell it. It is one of the more clump forming types. So it's going to be happier in kind of these poor or drier soils. If you, again, put it somewhere moist or relatively rich soil, it might get a little tall and fall over. But it's quite a lovely goldenrod. And another one you're likely to find is the golden fleece goldenrod, which is a selection of Solidago spacillata that was selected at the Mount Cuba Center, which is up in Delaware, and they are focused on Piedmont native flora. So it's another one that, like the fireworks, it's a relatively slow spreader, so it does well in landscapes. So you can explore and learn more about these and other goldenrods on the plant toolbox. You can see there's 21 different types of goldenrod covered in there, and I encourage you to, if you don't already have at least one type of goldenrod in your landscape, add one this year, maybe add another one next year. So they are wonderful plants and serve a lot of different insects. And we're a little bit over time, so I'm just going to shorten up the announcements to let you know that all of the announcements that we're running at the opening of the webinar are available. You can use the QR code to get there. We also include a link to it in our follow-up email. That includes all of our PPP, like today's recording, and our follow-up resources from today are posted on the EMG intranet. And I look forward to seeing you next month. It will be our season finale. It'll be October 28th. And it's always a great time because we're going to have Critter or Not. So Matt and Mike will highlight some interesting pest and plant disease issues, not just limited to this year, but just interesting things they've seen. And we get to all join in and try to figure out if it is critter or not. So thank you all to everybody who was part of the program today and everybody who joined in. And we look forward to seeing you in October.